Hello, my name is Dr. James Danoff-Burg. I'm the Director of Conservation Engagement and Learning at the Living Desert Zoo and Gardens based here in Palm Desert, California in the United States. Our time today is the first of 11 sessions where we will talk about and give you ideas and opportunities to train for how to do social science research that answers conservation questions. So, without any further ado, I'll jump right in. I want to share with you a screen. And that is going to be the PowerPoint that I'll be using for this first day. The name of our workshop here together is called Building Community Conservation Success. And the goal of it, as I said, is to try to get you as a conservation biologist, as a conservationist, however you define yourself, up to speed so that you could, by the end of our sessions together, go out and implement a research program that's designed to try to better understand how your community that lives around where you're doing your conservation work perceives you, perceives that animal, perceives the conservation question. It's the core component of doing community-based conservation. And we'll talk a lot about community-based conservation today and a couple different definitions and ways to get to it. So our goal today is to begin that process. We will first introduce the course. We'll talk a little bit about some of the materials, and we're going to be ending up the day talking about your question. Because the way that we've structured this class, these 11 sessions together, is that each session will have activities for you to do, activities for you to solve. And these activities will be directly relevant to a research question that you are going to create starting today. Maybe you have one in mind already. Fantastic, you're ahead of the game. If not, we will create one during our time together today in this lecture, and then also in the live Zoom discussion that we will have on Tuesday morning at 4 p.m. Central Africa time. So let's begin. And I'd like to see if I can share this. Having a little bit of technical issues here. There we go. So I'd like to first tell you a story. And it's a story that probably many of you already know. This is, of course, a cheetah. And cheetahs are one of the iconic species that conservationists the world over advocate for. For example, I don't know if you can see on our name badge, but at the top of our logo is a mountain. Underneath that mountain is a cheetah. So cheetah are a very iconic and very important species for us here at the Living Desert in all of our some of our conservation messaging. Cheetahs are really desirable among people who are very big supporters of conservation. People want them to be well, they're beautiful, they're grace, they're the fastest land animal. They're a wonderful species. Of course, there's a big problem with cheetah in areas of the world where cheetah live, and that's conflict with ranchers. Because ranchers view cheetah as an enemy. And as I said, most of you already know this. But cheetahs are viewed as an enemy by ranchers because it's perceived that cheetahs are taking the goats and sheep and young calves of cattle from their livelihood. So they're actually undermining the livelihood of the ranchers. And in countries like Botswana, for example, we have lots of conflicts between ranchers and cheetahs and other large carnivores as well, lions and African wild dogs and several others. So a community-based conservation effort would be focused on trying to address what is it about the ranchers? Are there behaviors, are there solutions that the ranchers might know about that conservationists may be able to share that we could actually create and work with local people to be able to make those things happen? Well, of course, as many of you know, dogs are an answer, are a solution to much of this conflict. And in Botswana, there's an organization called Cheetah Conservation Botswana. Some of you may work with them. We do as well here at the Living Desert. And they take young dogs, puppies, from the street that would otherwise be feral wild dogs making their living however wild dogs do in urban settings. They rear them with flocks of sheep, with groups of goats, and those dogs will therefore identify with those sheep and goats as their own family members. And as a consequence, they will ward off predators. And in areas on the north and northwest of Botswana, where Cheetah Conservation Botswana is active, that have these cheetah dogs in the pens with the animals or out in the open where the animals, the sheep and goats, are grazing, ranchers who have these dogs have experienced dramatic drops in losses to predators. In some cases, a complete elimination of any losses whatsoever. I tell this story because it's a wonderful example of how one can address the main problems that people are having, that ranchers are having, that are leading to conservation threats of iconic species, by working with communities, working with ranchers to figure out what are the reasons that you're losing your animals. What are some possible solutions? Dogs are, as many of you know, not a big part of the culture of ranchers in Botswana. And so that's a big shift to get people to be able to appreciate having dogs on grounds, on their houses, in their pens, out with their goats. But for farmers who have these dogs, they are massive advocates for them because they are literally saving their livelihood. Knowing that, finding out that process requires solid science data. And one of the ways that we can get that is, of course, by talking with ranchers, by asking them questions. We have to be able to, though, ask the right kinds of questions, to be able to structure the right kinds of surveys to be able to answer those questions. And that's what our goal is together for these next 11 weeks, is to try to come up with solutions as elegant and as effective as these cheetah dogs have been for Botswanan ranchers. All right. So this feeds into our next question here, and answer this on your own in a very general sense. Why are most species declining all over the world? If you thought about it and you said, us, because of human actions, you are correct. Right? This is a map of the Earth, and overlain on that map is, of course, areas of greatest human impact to least human impact. Red is the greatest amount. Deep green, which covers much of Botswana down here in South Central Africa, is least affected. You can see that much of the other areas that are deep green are vast deserts, tundras, Arctic covers, the central desert in Australia, and the Amazon. But Botswana is an interesting one because it is an epicenter of biological diversity, as well as being relatively less affected by human activity. So, because this context that we were talking about earlier with the cheetah and the cheetah dog study is in the setting of Botswana, which is an area that is one of the most rich, biologically diverse, relatively untouched areas, it provides us a great opportunity to keep it that way and maybe even improve it by working with communities, because people are the problem, including us, all of us who are participating in this workshop and leading the workshop. We are the problem, as well as people locally in areas. We are also the solution. So if we can work with communities to make these things, these processes better, work more functionally, everybody wins. So let's try to stop that question, or the negative answer to that question, that most species are declining because of human activity, and instead turn it around and say that we are retaining most species biodiversity and richness because of human activity. That's a very big goal we set for ourselves here. So community-based conservation is the approach that we're talking about here, right? These are a series of quotes from some friends and collaborators and colleagues of mine. that really nicely illustrate the importance of community-based conservation from their experiences. All of these people are are conservation biologists first and foremost. And so what they do is work with species, work with ecosystems mostly. But almost all people who do that, who make a living working in the field to try to conserve species, we very quickly realize that it is because of humans that species are declining. And it's also that humans are the solution to that problem. And by doing that, we need to place humans and their needs as a central consideration for when we're designing our conservation projects. And again, we can't know what people's needs are unless we can ask them their needs and their priorities in a very clear and scientifically rigorous, unbiased fashion. So here's a series of great quotes. I love the first one: the ends do not justify the means. We need to care for the people living nearby our conservation areas as well, right? We can't just exclude people and say the area is protected. We need to be able to make certain that the people that live near, around, or maybe in those protected areas can benefit from those protected areas in a way that is sustainable and good for the environment, right? I love the quote from Resen Kantai Duf as well. The solution is to empower and develop the people who live around the natural areas to allow them to help nature. That's really the thing, right? Because for me, as Jim Sanderson from Small Wild Cats Conservancy summarized it very nicely, conservation is not a biological science, really. Right? When we get into it, conservation is a social science because species are threatened by human activities, and so humans can help to solve those problems as well. So our goal is to try to get us all up to speed with at least functional knowledge about how social science works and how it can apply in a conservation setting. We will do that together over these next 11 sessions. Because the benefits of community-based conservation, and you'll see this CBC quite frequently through my slides, as well as CBCE, which is community-based conservation engagement, which is a subset of CBC, just as a heads up. The benefits of community-based conservation are many. For conservation, we're helping to address the cause of the problem, right? Not just the symptoms. The declines of species is a symptom. The cause for those declines are usually a human activity. In the case of the cheetah's population declines is the symptom. So releasing more cheetah into the environment would not solve the problem, right? To address the cause, the root cause, which is the conflict between the ranchers and the cheetah, that is the cause. That is really the goal of an effective conservation strategy. So if we can, through community-based conservation, understand what our communities are thinking and to be able to find those happy intermediate intersections between people and the environment where the two can intermesh and interdigitate well so that both benefit, right? So not only do we address the cause and not just the symptoms, but we lead to improved sustainability as well. Because when people in the area are benefiting by conservation, are they going to be opposed to conservation? No, right? They're going to be in favor of it. They're going to want it to continue. So those ranchers are the best advocates for cheetah dogs. And that leads to the sustainability of that program, just as one example of one program among many. Similarly, the programs not only are addressing the cause, are more sustainable, but they are more effective and they're of a higher quality. Right? People in the area know what the problems are. Those people in those communities know probably what some initial solutions could be. And if we work with them to find those solutions that they have a hand in developing, they will be so much more supportive of it. The program will be sustainable, it'll be a better quality, and it'll be effective. So from the perspective of communities, by involving communities throughout our conservation process, from creation of the idea to implementation of the outcome and monitoring of that outcome, we give communities lots of power, right? We empower and build capacity among our people who are now allies to conservation. So the benefits to communities are many. They have the ability to guide and direct interventions. Instead of things just happening to them, they can be a part of the process of determining the process. As I said earlier, there's sustainability for a project. That sustainability comes about because the local communities have ownership of the project. They have ownership of the ideas. They're going to be so much more supportive of the project. And then last, if the project can actually lead to improvements in jobs or income, as in, again, the case of the cheetah dogs, improved income because there weren't those losses that they had been suffering, the ranchers, for many, many decades, people will win, right? So they're more likely to benefit by being able to guide and direct the interventions. They have greater ownership and support for the project because they're involved in its creation and development. And also, if they benefit through the creation of additional jobs or better jobs or improved income, it's fantastic. There are many other benefits. These are the main ones that I think summarize most of them. So the benefits of community-based conservation are huge to both conservation and to communities. All right. So this workshop that we are doing now is a follow-up and an expansion of a workshop series that I've been doing over the last few years, last 3 years. Last November, the most recent one that I did actually was in Maun in Botswana, and these are some of the participants. We had over 40 people participating in this amazing workshop, and it was really fantastic. It was at the Botswana Wildlife Training Institute, and some of the participants in this photo are probably participating today. And so this workshop that we're doing today and over these next 11 sessions together is an expansion of the workshop that we did together in Maun last November. So any of you who were here before, welcome back. Hopefully this will feel very fresh. If not, if you're new to the process, welcome. We will do this together. So the way that I structure these in-person workshops, and I'd like to follow that same kind of a setup here, is that there are 3 levels of support for all participants in this workshop. So you are not alone in this process. First off, there's within your organization support. So for example, here we have the Botswana Department of Wildlife and National Parks that are the lead of this process, this workshop that we're in right now. And for the workshop that we did in November, they were a part and a participant in that as well. And in addition, we had from several universities, from international conservation organizations, and local community trusts as well. So we had multiple people from each organization. There was support within each organization. So if you're a person who goes to a workshop, as you probably have before, and you come back from that workshop and you're full of good ideas and great intervention plans and ways to go forward, but you're alone, you come back to your organization and the same things continue. And not much has changed. The benefit of having multiple people from the same organization, in the case of our workshop today, it seems the entire organization of PWTI, working together, you can support each other and say, oh, I didn't exactly get what they were talking about with respect to sampling. What was stratified sampling? And then the other person can say, oh yeah, that's when we do this. So there's intra-organizational support, within organization support. Similarly, there's regional organization support, because all of these organizations on the screen have gone through this training program. Many of them are using it, quite the techniques that we've talked about in here, quite repeatedly, a number of times already. You have regional support. So across Botswana, there are many people who have gone through this workshop already. And so there are ways that we can learn from people who've already been through the workshop and have been building and implementing this process too. So we can learn as a new group of people through this workshop from previous workshops. It's a great benefit. And then last is that internationally, we are here to support you. the zoos and aquariums across all of North America. I have many friends who are evaluators, and we are members of the Association for Zoos and Aquariums here at the Living Desert as well. And this network of people want to help you. So myself and my staff are, one of whom I'll be talking about in just a moment, are here to support you over the long term. But in addition, I have other collaborators who would love to be able to help you do what you do better and help you train others in what they're doing better as well. So you're not alone. After you go through this workshop, there's a whole series of networks that support you. So I'd like to send along a couple thank yous. First off, to my host institution, the Living Desert Zoo and Gardens. I feel very blessed to work at such a great organization with a chief executive officer and president and board of directors and staff who are so supportive of this idea and have made this possible. So thank you to the Living Desert Zoo and Gardens. And also for local organization and logistics for our workshop here together through the Botswana Wildlife Training Institute. I wanted to thank the Department of Wildlife and National Parks in Botswana, as well as in particular, Kenosi Nkape, who has been so fantastically helpful with helping to set up this workshop and make this possible. So thank you to all people who have been involved and to Kenosi in particular. Thank you. And then last is our host, of course, because the host is the government of Botswana Ministry of Environment, Wildlife and Tourism, under which I understand the Department of Wildlife and National Parks sits. And they make it possible for you to spend your time in our workshop together. So thank you to Ministry for this process. And the lights in my office just went out. So they can be activated when I wave my arms. So I guess I'm going to be doing that repeatedly through our time together. So thank you to the Living Desert. Thank you to the Department of Wildlife and National Parks and BWTI in particular, the Botswana Wildlife Training Institute. And thank you to the Ministry of Environment, Wildlife and Tourism in the government of Botswana. It takes many people to bring us together. So thank you to all of our supporters here. I think it's helpful to know a little bit about the people that you're working with or learning from. And one of the first ones, I'll start off with myself. So I am a PhD social science researcher, and I was born and raised in the US, although I've lived in many other countries around the world for multiple months at least. My PhD was from the University of Kansas, and I had a postdoc. My undergraduate was from the University of Michigan, if you know that school as well, go blue. I was also a postdoctoral research fellow at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City, Fulbright scholar recently through with the Applied Ecological Research Foundation in India, and past positions, I was a professor of conservation at Columbia University for almost a decade and a half, was the director of education at the San Diego Zoo before coming here, am also founding director and still on the board of Helping Rhinos USA, an organization that's trying to help conserve rhinos in Southern Africa. And I'm also a consultant to zoos and aquariums across the country and around the world on evaluation and education consultations. Currently, I am the Director of Conservation Engagement and Learning at the Living Desert Zoo and Gardens, and I'm also an adjunct professor of conservation psychology at the University of California, San Diego, where I teach a class. Now, the other person who's going to be joining us on this workshop, the live workshop on Tuesday when we start, is my colleague, Alexandra Ocañas. And Alex, and I spell out her last name there, Ocañas, in case you don't know Spanish, was born and raised in the US. She's from Texas. She got her undergraduate at a small liberal arts college in Texas called Austin College, and recently a master's of science and resource conservation at the University of Montana. She's been a coordinator at the Center for Environmental Studies at Austin College, and also a program assistant for an international study abroad program at the University of Montana. And also on the side was a monitoring coordinator for the Flathead Wild and Scenic River. So she's done a lot of great things. And currently we are lucky and blessed to have her be our conservation social scientist here at the Living Desert. And from my understanding, she might be the only person who has that title at all zoos and aquariums across the North American Association for Zoos and Aquariums, AZA. So she might be the first of her kind, and she's really awesome, and you'll certainly come to agree with that too. She'll be leading several of our workshops, several of these recorded ones, and will be participating in all of our live workshops as well, as will I. So I've mentioned the Living Desert Zoo and Garden several times, and that we are based in Palm Desert, California. This is our entry portal. Our goal is to create unforgettable natural experiences and connections between people and nature. We have a giraffe feeding area that is one of our most popular areas. Our mission is desert conservation through preservation, education, and appreciation. So we are very much focused on desert ecosystems, as we say in our name, and as you can see in our logo, the cheetah. We are very much focused on deserts and drylands. In Africa, North America, the US and Mexico mostly, and also in Australia. We started off as just a nature preserve with a hiking trail in 1970, 50 years ago this year. And we broke 500,000 guests last year during 2019, actually. So we did it ahead of our projected schedule. This year, of course, is going to be quite different with changes in movement and things because of the coronavirus. But we've been growing and on this great trajectory. We are a gem, I think, in zoos across North America. And also last year, we were voted the #1 zoo in America based on Yelp reviews. Yelp, the international evaluation and ratings system. We had the highest rating on Yelp, average rating, from visitors who come to the organization of any zoo or aquarium in North America. It took us very much by surprise. So it's something worth trumpeting, and so I'll share it with you too. We are located down here in where the more northern of those red dots are. This is a map of the United States, of course, and it shows the biodiversity of species across the country of the United States. This is, of course, the United States with our 48 contiguous states, and then Hawaii shown down on the bottom left. And bottom right. And so the red areas are areas with the highest biodiversity. And as you can see, one of the highest biodiversity areas in North America, in the United States, is the Coachella Valley, which is the valley in which we are based in the Living Desert. So we focus quite a bit on the native species that are found in our valley. About half of our conservation projects are based right here. And the Coachella Valley is the name of the valley in which Palm Desert and the Living Desert exist. Hawaii, of course, has much higher biodiversity, but it is an amazing place as well. But the Coachella Valley is unique because we go from sea level in a very dry desert wash up to almost 3,000 meters in elevation in a small area. I'm sorry, almost 4,000 meters in elevation in a very small area. And so as a consequence, we have a great diversity of life zones. It's a very biologically diverse place. And so as a consequence, us being based there provides us the opportunity to be able to care for and help out many of these species. And a lot of what we do in ecosystems, and a lot of what we do is based on working with communities, getting communities to support, to change their behavior in ways that are more sustainable, using the exact set of skills that we're building among all of us here today. We work mostly, as I said, in Africa and North America, and we'll soon be getting started in some projects in Australia as well. The left side, or the side of the screen nearest North America, is all of some of our species that we work on here, and then we work on quite a few in Africa, of course. So that's a little bit about the workshop, a little bit about us, individuals, as well as our zoo. And now let's talk a little bit more about the structure of our workshop here. So we are meeting for 11 days, Tuesdays and Thursdays, every morning at 5 p.m. with the exception, Botswana, Central African time, with the exception of this first meeting on Tuesday, the 9th of June, when we are meeting at 4 p.m. Central Africa time. So we're going to start off today with day 1, communities and social science, an introduction to some course concepts and some core concepts. And then we'll get into more general or more specific activities about research design in days 2 and 3. We'll talk about how to collect some data. We'll craft a survey on day 5 and a protocol for its implementation. We'll talk about some alternatives to structured surveys, which is going to be our focus on days 5 and 6. So some things that don't involve asking survey questions, more involved, interesting, engaging kind of ways. And then we're going to talk a bit about data analysis on day 6, especially for quantitative data, which is numerical data, counts and frequencies. On days 9 and 10, we're going to focus on qualitative data. And qualitative data are collected in a more open-ended fashion. So instead of giving people, say, a rating on a scale of 1 to 10 of how much they appreciate something, they might instead say, what do you think about that thing? It's an open-ended question, and they could say about anything that they want. So that is a type of qualitative data. We'll talk quite a bit about that in the next few days before we even get to days 9 and 10. But 9 and 10 will be focused on research design and data collection, and then of course analysis on day 10. And we'll finish up the whole course with trying to wrap it all together so that we'll have an implementation plan for the project that you are developing starting today all the way through date 11. So we're going to emerge from this workshop not just with a better understanding of how social science works and how it can be best functioned and implemented, but also we will have a project in hand, completed, by the end of our time together. It's very exciting. Our goal is to get you from the idea point to almost to the success point. So we will take you halfway there. We will get you through the planning. We'll create the question, we'll create the survey, we'll create the method, we'll create the analysis, we'll plan for the implementation, we'll have the project all together. And then the last part, you will make happen, because you will be doing the execution. You will be collecting the data, we'll be hiring the people, we'll be employing the students or whomever your data collectors are to analyzing the data and interpreting the data. And then making the changes that are going to lead to this conservation successes that we want. So the green part is our workshop. The red part is the part that you're going to be doing kind of on your own, but also with our support. Right? We talked about those 3 levels of support, the intra-organizational. So within the Botswana Wildlife Training Institute, there's going to be a lot of support because it seems almost everyone is going through the workshop together. So thank you for participating in this and continuing. It's a great honor on our part to be able to work with you all in this way. But then second, there's also that regional support. So all those other organizations that were on that earlier slide, if you have questions or want to see how they've done things. And then third, we have the international support provided to you through ourselves, through the Living Desert Zoo and Gardens, and the network of people that we have created to work with you. So let's begin that journey. So to begin that journey, our class structure is that we will have these recorded videos on YouTube, and we'd like you to watch them before we meet. So if we're meeting on Tuesday morning, try to watch it at least by Monday afternoon so that the ideas are in your head. If you want to watch it multiple times, fantastic. They are there for you to watch as many times as you want and to come back to them after we've gone through further down the workshop together. So those videos will be on YouTube, and they're going to be a specific link that can only be used, is the only way that you can access the video. So if you search for them, they will not come up. You'll have to have the link. The link will be shared in our WhatsApp group that we've been using. So recorded videos on YouTube. Second, we'll have live conference calls on Zoom. And this is the link that we will be using every Tuesday and Thursday at 5 p.m. Botswana time. with the exception of our first one on the 9th of June, Tuesday, this coming Tuesday, we will be meeting at 4 p.m. Okay, so this first meeting is at 4 p.m., 7 a.m. my time in California. And Alex and I will be there to talk with you through the development of your question. And that's our whole goal of that first conference call this Tuesday. Last, there is a Facebook group. Most of you probably have already joined, but if you have not, make certain that you go to this group. I'm spending a lot of time talking about this so that you can copy down these numbers, these URLs, excuse me, and ask to be joined, ask to join. So they are private group, and the private group can only be joined if you are approved. So send along a request for participation, and we will accept it. And then on Facebook, we will have our discussions. So there'll be a prompt at the top of the page or on the page, and we'll want you to try to answer that prompt. And there might be multiple prompts, multiple questions that we're asking you that are relevant to your question, your research program that you're developing together. So this is how we're going to be having a discussion about these topics, is on our Facebook group. I hope that makes sense. And then in addition, we also have, of course, our WhatsApp group that we can use for discussions about, oh, what was that link again? What time are we meeting up? Those kinds of things. So we have these 3 modes that I have on the screen, as well as the WhatsApp group. Okay, so what we are doing today, and we've done a lot of this already. We are talking about the experimental design and what conservation psychology is, where it fits into the broader scheme of things, and then finishing up by defining a research question. So we've done point 1, and we'll get to those ground rules in just a moment. We've been introducing ourselves to you, and we'll be introducing ourselves to each other on our live Zoom chats. And then we'll next talk about the conservation psychology and how it fits into other things. And then we'll begin the process of defining a research question that is social science focused and is conservation intended. All right. So any group that gets together needs to have ground rules. It's part of the process. So it's going to be a little different in the setting that we're in here, which is a recorded video, but when we are together on the Zoom chats and also on our Facebook groups, make certain that you leave all personal agendas at the door. Don't engage in any long-term office politics that have been going on or personal vendettas. Leave those out, right? Focus just on the topics. Focus just on the ideas. And speaking of ideas, all ideas are valid. If someone has an idea, maybe it could be refined, but it's still valid. And along those lines of maybe it can be refined, all ideas can be improved. Everything I'm saying can be improved. Everything that Alex is going to be saying, it also can be improved, right? All ideas can be improved, so try to be as much as possible open to the new ideas that we are all exploring here together. And that will help us really function well. Similarly, I would love everyone to be able to participate. Ideally, not one person is speaking a lot during our Zoom calls or posting all of the time on our Facebook group. I love passion, I love participation, but please do provide space for other people to be able to participate. Because when everyone participates and we listen to each other, we learn so much. It makes classes so much better. And if we treat each other with respect, we'll hear more of what people are saying, and we are more likely to be treated with respect and to be listened to as well. There probably will be differences of opinion or problems with the topic or a platform or an access or something with the course that will come up. And that's all right. We will address those together. This is a multi-platform kind of function, and we're going to have problems, I can guarantee. So let's be patient with each other, and we will address those things. And we'll also try to stay on schedule to the best of our abilities. The Zoom calls are scheduled for an hour. Alex and I are happy to stay on afterwards to continue discussions with people who would like to be able to do so. And we'll also have a live chat going during those as well, so that if one of us are leading, say if Alex is leading that week's Zoom call, I'll take the comments and I will share them to Alex for her to answer. And that's how we'll go forward. But we will try to stay on schedule, and in the 11 sessions that we'll be together, we are going to make great things happen, because we will finish up our study plan by the end of that workshop. Promise. 11 sessions by the 14th of July is, I think, our last session. We will have an entire program together for you to begin implementing on the 15th of July. Let's make it happen. Also, I wanted to share, this is what I call the running man, and the running man is us getting active. So we are going to make things happen. Whenever there is a running man on the screen, it's going to be a trigger for you to do something. It might be to not jot down some things, like say our ground rules. We have these ground rules, of course, on our Facebook page as well. And those are there for your review as often as you would like. But when the running man comes on, it's a great cue for you to pause the video, this video, or any of the other recorded ones, so that you can jot down these ideas. So with that, pause the video, please, and get active. Take down these notes. All right, so now we're going again. We'll continue on. What I'd like to be able to do while we're contextualizing the field of conservation psychology and underneath not just social sciences, but within conservation as a whole, is to talk about this wonderful 4 phases of conservation idea that was published a few years ago, 6 years ago, by Georgina Mace in the magazine Science, the research magazine Science. She broke up the history of science starting back in the 1960s, late 1950s, into 4 phases. And as you can see, the first 2 phases were about 20 years each. The 3rd phase down is about a decade. And then the last phase, also about a decade. But what's more important than the timing is the sequence and the focus. Right? Initially, when conservation began, it was very much focused on species protection, putting fences around things, separating people from nature, protecting nature, and making certain that those protected areas are functioning by themselves. And this is a legacy that has still continued, as you can see by the green bar going all the way down to the bottom, which is present at the bottom of the screen. So this ethic has still continued. There are a lot of organizations that are still doing this. There are a lot of countries that focus on this quite a bit. Nature for itself, put a wall around it, keep people out as much as possible. We need wilderness, we need protected areas, and it benefits the species. Very much focused just on the biology, right? The legacy of conservation really is that. And we still continue with that in the United States, in Botswana, all over the world. Next phase started in about the 1980s when I was starting to go to graduate school, is nature despite people. Like, what are the threats? My gosh, nature is really threatened. How is this taking effect? What are the mechanisms for species decline? Because people started seeing those species decline in the 60s, 70s, early 80s. We started to come up with understandings for it, understanding the threats of extinction, of habitat loss, of pollution, of overexploitation, bigger picture issues that were starting to bubble, like ideas of climate change, for example. And this was really focused on population biology, natural resource management. So again, very conservation biology focused, biology being the focal point there. Next, in the early 2000s, we started thinking about nature benefiting people, and that this being a reason that nature should be conserved. And again, the nature despite people, the threats still continue to the day. Same with the preservation, the nature for itself. Nature for people is focused this idea is focused on how people benefit from healthy ecosystems, right? Through ecosystem functions, water retention, soil creation, production of timber, production of wildlife, production of game, whatever, what have you. And this is the third phase of conservation. We're starting to get more into the human realms here, right? With environmental economics. That's a human-focused field. Last, since about 2010, really for me, I started working in this field in the mid-2000s, around 2006, 2007, is focused on people in nature. I was trained as a biologist. I was trained in nature for itself. My main focus was the nature despite people. My research was very much focused on that, the impacts of human activities on population declines of beetles and ants. I'm an entomologist by training, and the ecosystems in which they live. But when I realized, after being in that field for a while, that the reason why, the way that we could conserve those species is through engaging people, I started to realize I need to focus more on social sciences. I need to focus more on working with people. I need to learn better from communities about what they know so that we can learn how to better conserve those species, make them more sustainable as an ecosystem, and make them benefit and be beneficial in the eyes of local communities. Because otherwise we are in the nature despite people. We're fighting communities. Let's work with communities. So this people in nature phase is the most recent form of conservation and is one that I'm particularly passionate about. I'm passionate about the other three phases as well, the other sets of tools. There's lots of tools in our toolbox. These are 4 phases, each with a set of tools in them. We need to have them all. But from my perspective, the most effective one is this people in nature approach. Right? Working with people, social sciences, working with ecological sciences, working with communities to learn about resilience in communities of people, communities of ecosystems, adaptability of communities of people, and how humans and ecological systems work together in this sort of mixed, pinned socio-ecological systems. That's what we're working on here, right? This is our focus, this people in nature. So much so, a friend of mine, this is Wes Schultz. He was a professor of mine, or not a professor of mine, a friend of mine at a university that I taught at for a while in California called the California State University in San Marcos. And Wes published this book, or this article, in 2011, the very start of the people and nature part of things, saying that conservation means behavior. Behavior is conservation, and conservation needs behavioral change. This is the citation for it. We'll have it available for you on the Facebook page as well. And within that, there are 4 important challenges that he points out. The first is that education does not typically result in increases in conservation behavior. You can teach people about the beauty of cheetahs and that they are the fastest land animals and that they deserve a place on the earth and that they're an important part of the ecological system. But that education typically does not result in increases in environmental behavior and conservation behavior. Right? Second, our human thinking is biased and tends to promote short-sighted responses to environmental threats. So if there is a problem with cheetahs, we need to introduce more cheetahs into the area, right? That's a short-sighted solution to a larger environmental threat. That's addressing the symptoms, as I was saying earlier, not so much the problem, the cause of the problem. So often our thinking is biased and promotes short-sighted responses. Third, we generally perceive ourselves as separate from nature. I am inside an air-conditioned place with lighting and books and tables and things around me. This is not nature. How am I connected to nature? Whatever happens in nature doesn't directly affect me, is what this challenge says. Right? People do believe this. We see ourselves as separate from nature. And so therefore, I don't need to worry so much about nature for my own well-being. And fourth of the challenges that Wes poses to conservation as a whole is that social norms guide our behavior. A social norm is when I am doing something because everybody else is doing that same thing. Or I see some people, some groups of people doing that, and I think that's the right thing to do. I want to continue to do that, right? We are a social species, like these fellows on the slide with the football helmets on. This is American football, of course. And we want to work together as a social species to do similar things. So what is the normative behavior? What is the normal behavior for a community? That's probably what most people are going to do. So social norms guide behavior. These four challenges, that education does not typically result in increases in conservation behavior, that our thinking is biased and short-sighted, that we perceive ourselves as separate from nature, and that social norms guide our behavior. They're challenges, but they can also be tools, right? Because conservation means behavior and we have these challenges, our behavior is the primary cause of environmental problems, as we said earlier, but changing that behavior is possible. And changing that behavior is central to our goals of conservation and sustainability, right? We can change that behavior in, I'll say, four ways. First is through improving the technological efficiency of something. We grow more crops per unit area with better technology in whatever form, right? That's one way to lead to behavior change. Give people a more efficient technology. Second, we can legislate it and make it legally impossible to do the things. So for example, the elephant hunting ban in Botswana, which until recently was there a very unpopular, as I understand, law, but effective at increasing the populations of elephants pretty dramatically, so much so that now, as I understand, they are a major problem because they're so overpopulated in some parts of Botswana. So policy and law is a second way. Third, we can make structural investments to change behavior. If we want people to go in a certain direction, we pave that road better over any of the other alternative routes. People will go that way. That structural investment of improving the road is a way to make people go that way, to use that transit route, right? That could be a way in conservation that we move people away from a sensitive area of a park. We improve the road in another area of the park that takes people away from that sensitive area, maybe where there's a large aggregation of nesting birds, for example, just as an example. Fourth, and this is the one that we're focusing on for all of our time together, is that we're trying to encourage individual and voluntary pro-environmental actions, right? Which basically means we're trying to get people to want to change their own behavior in ways that help conservation. So if we can encourage individuals to change their behavior on their own, to see it that is in their best interest, to act more conservation-minded, more pro-environmental, we will be more successful. This is the focus of what we're doing here. And that's the focus of a field called conservation psychology, which is a lot of what we are doing and we'll talk about in our time together over these next 11 sessions. Right? I like to share this quote from Baba Dioum, who is a very famous Senegalese conservationist and Minister of Environment in Senegal, as I understand. That in the end, we'll conserve what we love what we'll understand only what we are taught. However, remember the first challenge from Wes Schultz's article about conservation means behavior is that teaching people things, education does not lead to behavioral change by itself. We need to be able to engage in that process, right? So if we can work with local communities to engage them, not just to teach, not just to learn from, but to engage them in the process, that is how we lead to conservation, right? Teaching is important, but it is not enough. People need to be engaged. People need to be a part of that process. So engagement and education are both very important central conservation processes. So engagement, it could take the form of a lot of ways. In this case, it could be interviewing a woman and her child, or while she's taking care of her children, about what they think about a local conservation effort, right? Which is what's happening here. This is in South Africa, actually, with a research project that I was doing to better understand the impacts of the Black Mamba's all-women's anti-poaching unit that works in that area that probably many of you know of, and trying to see if people in the community, like this woman and her family, have changed their perception of conservation and wildlife as a consequence of interactions with the Black Mambas who live in those communities as well. So engaging people in the process through learning their opinions, through learning from their skills, implementing their skills, creating their things with their ideas, that is engagement, and that leads to big changes. So CBCE is my preferred focus. So it's not just community-based conservation, but it's community-based conservation engagement, because we're addressing the cause, not the symptoms. And this slide should look very familiar because it's the same as what we saw earlier, right? We're leading to sustainability, better quality, and more effective programs for conservation. And communities benefit in so many ways by helping to guide and direct the interventions because they're engaged in the process. They have greater ownership and support for the project because they're engaged in the creation of that project and the implementation of that project. And also they're engaged because they're getting jobs and income. This is an amazing opportunity. So our goal is pro-environmental behavior change that is locally appropriate and acceptable. So we want to change behaviors in ways that work for local people and that benefit local people. That's our goal. And whether that is just is doing the necessary primary research, trying to understand better what people think about, say, cheetahs or the Mokoro boats or what have you, or it's a direct trying to assess the impact of a study that, or of a behavior change campaign that we have tried to do already, that is still all trying to understand and promote pro-environmental behavior change that is locally appropriate and acceptable. So that's our goal. Behavior change in the short, but pro-environmental behavior change that is locally appropriate and acceptable. So that's our goal for this class. So within conservation psychology, there's this field called community-based social marketing, or CBSM. And a link to that book that describes that will be available on our Facebook group as well. But within that field, that subfield, that applied component of conservation psychology, they think of things in terms of barriers and benefits to that behavior change. Right? So if we want people to make a behavior change, there is some level of motivation intrinsically in people to make a behavior change. It might be low, it might be very high. Say in the case of the cheetah dogs with the ranchers, the adoption of the cheetah dog is the behavior change, the pro-environmental behavior change that is locally appropriate and acceptable that we want them to do, right? So if our behavior change goal is to have ranchers adopt cheetah dogs so that they won't kill cheetahs because the cheetahs won't be affecting their wildlife, there are a motivation, an intrinsic motivation for them to adopt that behavior change, but then there are also barriers that will stop people from wanting to make that behavior change. So how do we make behavior change happen? We have to get this motivation so that it is high enough, so people are motivated enough to want to make the behavior change so that the motivation is greater than the barriers to adoption, right? So there are two main ways that we could do that. First, we could reduce the size of the barriers. So instead of being very tall, we reduce the barriers. Maybe the barrier for adopting cheetah dogs is that cheetah dogs are expensive. Just getting the dog is expensive. Getting the trained dog is expensive. So if we can reduce that barrier by literally reducing the cost, by giving the cheetah dogs to people, because the funding comes from somewhere else, donors, funding agencies, what have you, then we have reduced the barrier to adoption. And that same level of motivation, or even elevated levels of motivation, will make it more likely that people will change their behavior and adopt a cheetah dog in their goats and with their sheep. Right? So there's the first one. First thing we could do is to reduce the size of the barriers. Similarly, we could maintain the same level of the barriers, right? Maybe they're still the same as expensive, the same price to adopt the dog, which is still a barrier, but we increase the motivation by pointing out, you know, if you talk to this rancher here and this rancher here and all of these other ranchers that are in the room with us right now, you'll learn that they all, when they paid to have that cheetah dog, they eliminated the mortality of their sheep and goats. So you can increase people's motivation through social norming. Remember, we talked about that as being one of the 4 challenges of human behavior, but here it could be an opportunity. So we make it the norm socially that people use cheetah dogs. And the farmer, or that rancher rather, who's considering adopting the cheetah dog, in the United States, we would call them ranchers, people who have goats and sheep, not necessarily farmers. So apologies for mixing those two up for Botswana. But if we were to talk to that farmer and say, all of these other farmers are also adopting the cheetah dogs, it will increase their motivation because of social norming, because they want to do what other people are doing that are successful. So even with the same price of the cheetah dog adoption, we can maximize the benefits. Ideally, we do both. Right? Ideally, we reduce the barriers and we increase the motivation so that the barrier to adoption is so insignificant that the behavior change will flow. So what I'd like you to think about, take a moment, think about some conservation challenge that you have that involves communities. Right? This is the first step towards creating our question. Within that problem, within that challenge that you have, that you're facing, or your students are facing, or that you know of exists near where you live, or in the country where you are, or something about which you're passionate, whatever it is. What are the barriers to it, or I'm sorry, what is the behavior change that you would like to try to change, to make happen? Pro-environmental behavior change that is locally appropriate and acceptable, ideally, first off. Second, what are the barriers for people to make that change? In the case with the cheetah dogs, the behavior change that we were hoping was people adopting cheetah dogs. The barrier to adoption, just for an example, was the cost. And the benefits could be several things. It could be the social norm, where everybody's doing it, you should too. It could be a financial benefit, that your losses are eliminated. It could be whatever it is. So take a few minutes now, pause the video, identify what is the behavior change you would like to make happen, pro-environmental behavior change. What are some barriers or possible barriers? They don't have to be real ones. What are some barriers that could be stopping people from making that behavior change? And second, or third rather, what are the benefits for why people would make the behavior change? Why would people want to make that behavior change? All right, so take a minute, stop the screen, and we'll get back going in a second. All right. So thank you for thinking about that. I hope that you came up with a question. If nothing else, I hope that you at least wrote down what we did with the cheetah and the cheetah dogs. So we talk about a theory of change for community-based conservation engagement. And our theory of change is pretty simple, that with increased education and with increased engagement, where people are involved in the conservation program and they learn more about the benefits of that conservation program, we get greater sustainability of conservation. which also leads to greater support for conservation, which also leads to greater species conservation, right? So in essence, what we're trying to do is to maximize our education, maximize our engagement of communities with this conservation challenge and make it more sustainable, lead to greater support, and to lead to species conservation, right? A theory of change is a useful tool to better understand how we would proceed forward, right? This is a general one that applies and probably will apply to many of the projects that you're going to be working on and many of the problems that you're trying to address, right? Okay, so our goal is behavior change. So for example, this is just a silly thing. There's a saying in Canada that skating with scissors is a very bad idea. I think that's generally applicable. It's roller skating with the skates on your shoes. And so what would be the behavior change effort that we would want people to make? In this case, it's sort of a pro continued existence behavior change, right? If you said removal of the scissors, that's what we want, right? We'd have to figure out what are the barriers to losing those scissors and what would be the benefits, which are pretty obvious, not having scissors stab us as we fall with them. It would be the behavior change benefit, right? So the goal of behavior change of community-based conservation is behavior change. So when you're talking about and thinking about your research programs, what behaviors do you want to change? Keep that in mind as we go forward, all right? And so much so that continuing on with what we were talking about earlier on that last slide, what is your goal? What is the behavior change? Think back to your previous experience that you just did on that last action slide. What is your goal for your project? What would you like people to do more of or less of? Pause the slide. All right, so after jotting that down, let's continue on. So when we do science, and social science is a science in the same way that natural sciences or biology is a science, we go through this repeated cycle, which we sometimes call an iterative process. Iterative, I-T-E-R-A-T-I-V-E, just means repeated. So with this iterative process, this circular process, we might start with an observation. And then we might ask a question based on that observation. And then after we have that question in mind, we might make some hypotheses as to how that question may be answered. We might create an experiment to test those sets of hypotheses, which one will be best used and best supported by the data to answer the question. And then we do some analysis about how to implement it. That might create some new observations, some new questions, some new hypotheses, and so on. So for example, we might have the observation that cheetah populations are declining. And it seems to be conflicts with ranchers. We might ask the question, well, what is the conflict that ranchers are having with cheetah? And we create several hypotheses. Maybe they're intimidated by cheetahs personally. Maybe the obvious one of them taking the livestock. Maybe they see them as taking resources that would be necessary for their livestock, what have you, right? Each of these are different hypotheses. And then we might go out and create an experiment where we go and talk to people and ask them, why do you not like, well, how do you feel about cheetahs? And if you don't like them, why? If you do like them, why? And then we analyze our data and we make an observation that says, oh, it seems like people who are farmers with goats and sheep are don't like cheetahs rather, because cheetahs are taking their crops, taking their livestock. So how can we, with the question then, how can we stop that conflict from happening? Well, Possibly we could try to reduce the amount of cheetahs that are taking livestock or that have access to livestock, possibly through the use of a dog. And then we do an experiment with that, we analyze the data, and it continues again, and we can keep refining and improving our question. Right? Here's another example of that scientific method, because this is what we're doing. We're doing science, right? We're doing social sciences. So let's talk about this process. We might follow the path of a baby, because babies are constantly doing science. Babies are like the most active scientists I think we could ask for, because everything in their world is unknown, and they have to experiment with everything. And so they might come up to a piece of something on the ground and say, oh, I wonder what this thing is. And then they might form a hypothesis, and they might say, oh, I wonder if I can eat it. And then they perform the experiment. They eat the thing. And then they analyze the data. How am I feeling? Oh, I'm not feeling particularly well. And then they report the findings by yelling at their parents and crying. And then last, of course, that replication process, that cycle that goes around, we might invite others to reproduce the results. Hey, try this. See what you think of this. It's a simple test, but it's still science, right? In the same way that the science is that we're doing here. So let's get to our questions. We've been talking about a couple different ways to get at this question in terms of what are the barriers and the benefits to some behavior change. You could use the same kind of scenario or setting that you were just discussing or just thinking through on those two previous opportunities to discuss things in terms of the goal of your behavior change component and what is the behavior change action that you would like to do, the barriers and benefits. So now with this one, let's write down your initial question, social science focused, conservation centered, that you would like to try to answer during our time together over these next 11 weeks. And by answer, I mean creating the method by which you will answer that question. So write down your initial question. Here are three possible simple experiments, three simple questions that could help to answer that. First, what do local people think of us, or of our animal, or of our conservation project, or of this protected area? What have you? What do local people think about something? Second, are women more receptive to conservation than are men? Just as an example. Is this group more likely to be receptive than this other group? Right? Third, what has been the impact of our intervention? What have we done and how has it changed things? If there's a lot of litter at where buses stop to pick up and discharge people, we went in and we did an intervention in that process by trying to talk to people getting on and off the bus to make certain that they dispose of their trash correctly. What has been the impact of our intervention? Right? So write down your first question, your first pass at a question that we will try to answer during our time together, or create the process by which we will answer this during our time together. All right? Write down your first initial question. What is the problem that you want to solve, and what would be a question that could answer it? Ideally following one of these three modes that I just laid out for you. So pause the screen now and write down your question. Okay, so now continuing on, the question is incredibly important. Not to place pressure on you, but there's a lot of pressure on making the question, because the question is that from which everything else originates. All of the other steps in science that we do, all of those other hypotheses and experimental design and data collection and data analysis and interpretation, all of that follows from your first and initial question. So we need to frame this very carefully, which is why we're going to be going through in these next couple slides, and we're almost done with our time together for this first module. The question needs to be framed very carefully, but also it needs to be testable, right? It needs to be something that can be answered in a specific way. Ideally, it could be supported or refuted, right? So we wouldn't just ask a question and then always support it, right? It needs to be asked in a way that it could be refuted. It could be said, no, it did not work, right? Our messaging to the bus patrons was unsuccessful. So we need to know that it can be tested, right? So think about your question that you wrote down on that last slide, and think about each of these components of that question. And think about your team, if you're working in a team setting for these processes for answering this question. If you're doing it yourself, that's great, but it's always good to get feedback from other people. So think about within your question, are people aware that the thing that you're asking them exists, right? If people don't know or don't take the bus, asking them whether bus stops are littered or dirty is not going to be an appropriate question, right? If people are not interacting with the experience, the species, the habitat, the place, whatever it is, then they are not going to be the right people to ask, right? So we have to think about who it is that we're asking. What would that community that you're talking to think of your project in terms of its value? Would they support it? The behavior change program that you're thinking of suggesting and trying to understand and research? Would they be willing to change their behavior? Are there opportunities for a livelihood improvement in this program as well? Because when we work that in, they are almost always more successful. Because when people benefit by conservation, they're going to be much more likely to support it. And which parts of the community, which constituents, are more likely to change their behavior than others? Okay. So now write what you think could be the answers to these questions. Right? Think about your larger question and whether these may help to influence or refine or change your question. Right? Are you asking of the right groups? Who are you asking? Well, how would they perceive the value of your question or of your project? Does the community already completely support it? In which case, you're not going to be able to change much behavior. Right? Are there opportunities for livelihoods that you could build into this? So jot these things down on your piece of paper, on your worksheet. All right, we'll pause the screen now, and then we'll continue on. Okay, so thank you for doing that. Continuing on now. We have a question that we first wrote down. Now what I'd like you to do is, and maybe you modified it a little bit on that last activity with the running man. But what I'd like you to think about is what kind of a question, what type of a question do you have? Because we have three main types of questions. So think about how close any of your questions are to any of these three questions that are on the screen. The first one, what do people think of our animal or us, or what do they think about something, is what we call a descriptive type of question. It's open-ended. It's very useful for the very early stages of a research program. What do local people think of this animal, of us, of this question, this problem, riding buses, of cheetahs, of whatever, right? This is a descriptive kinds of question. In contrast, the second one is an associative question. Are women more receptive to conservation than are men, right? Do women associate with greater receptivity to question than do men? Is there an association based on gender with an outcome? That's why it's called associative. So do women associate with being more receptive to conservation than do men? Is there a difference between one group and another? That's an associative question. And then last, if we are doing something, if we are making a change and trying to create a different outcome, if we are talking to those people at the bus stops where buses stop and asking them to dispose of their trash in the receptacles that we've provided that were not there prior, has there been less litter on the ground, just as an example? Right? Then we would go through the places where we put out the litter baskets, put out the signage, or had the speaking with people, and we tried to see whether the litter baskets or the behavior change by themselves, the discussions were more successful relative to each other, or maybe a third condition where we had both the garbage bins, the trash bins, as well as the requests, the behavior change. What has been the impact of our 3 treatment type of intervention? Right? This is a causal kind of question. If we have done something, did it lead to a cause, or was it the cause for a change? Okay. So descriptive, associative, and causal. 3 main kinds of research questions. It's useful to know which we have, descriptive, associative, or causal, because we'll be using that a lot over these next 11 sessions together. So look at your question in its current state, and we're going to be changing it again in the future, so don't feel like you have the final one or it's not good enough yet. It will get there. So look at your question in its current state. Is it a descriptive question? What do people think about something? Is it an associative question? Is group A different from group B? Or is it a causal, where we have done something that could have caused a change in the community? Right? So we'll take a moment to write that down now. Okay, so continuing on. We can improve our goals by asking good questions, and we can try to make that happen by making our questions very SMART. Right? SMART is an acronym probably many of you have heard already, which is 5 different words that all start with a letter that is part of the word SMART. So they need to be specific, they need to be measurable, they need to be attainable, they need to be relevant, and they should ideally be time-based, right? So specific in the sense of it's a specific location. Say with the bus stop thing, we would only be going to bus stops, right? The specific location. Or if we're focused on cheetahs and ranchers, we would only want to work with ranchers, or farmers rather, where there are cheetahs that live around them. There's no sense in working with farmers who don't have a threat of cheetahs to do a cheetah dog program. Right? It needs to be measurable in that it can be something that we can count or assess in some way, right? We can see the percent or number of litter pieces on the ground, for example, by where the buses are stopping. Measurable. Attainable, the question should be something that is possible to be done, right? So it's not that we are trying to eliminate all litter from all places where buses stop everywhere. We're trying to reduce the quantity of litter that is present at these places, right? Because it may not be attainable to be able to stop all litter, but if we measure the percent change, the percent reduction because of our actions, that is an attainable approach. Okay? The thing that we want to measure should be relevant to our question. So if sticking again with the litter, we wouldn't want to think about the biodiversity of birds in an area as being something that we would measure, because that data is not relevant to our question. Right? Lastly, it should be time-based, meaning that we're going to do the intervention for a certain amount of time and we will measure the change after that time has passed. Right? So 5 good ideas to go with. And people change this quite a bit. You might have seen a smarter goal or a bunch of other things where they add on 2 other words too, for example. But SMART is a great tool. And at the bottom of the screen is this website called orangeshoe.com that talks much more about SMART goals. On this next screen, in case you'd like to see that or take a screenshot of it, this goes into a bit more detail about what each of these mean. What does specific mean? What does measurable mean? What does attainable mean? What does relevant mean? What does time specific mean? Okay, so take a screenshot of this one if you would like to have this available to yourself. And if not, we will move on. All right, so what I'd like you to think about now, think about those SMART goals, specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound, and try to take your question and improve them. It doesn't have to affect, you don't have to have each of those 5 components be integrated, but to the degree that it's possible and relevant, think about changing your question so that you can ask each of those components as a part of it, right? How specific is that question? How measurable is there a measurable component to it? Is it attainable, that change that you're trying to make happen? Is it realistic that that change could happen? And is it time bound within a certain amount of time? So over 6 months, for example, will people be able to reduce the amount of litter on the ground by 40% with our behavior intervention? That's a beautifully phrased, smarter goal, because it addresses the time bound, it addresses the relevance because it's talking about reducing litter, it's attainable 20%, it's measurable 20% reduction, and it's specific, litter in bins, right? So take a moment now and try to make your question SMART to the degree that you can. Okay, so now let's unpause and continue on. Thank you for that. We will talk about all of these stages during our live Zoom session on Tuesday at 4 p.m. So what I'd like you to do now is share your question with others. Connect with your friends who are going through this same workshop together and see if you can learn from each other. This is what I did. Could it be improved? Ask them to tell you what they did. Give them suggestions on how to make it smarter, on how to identify the barriers and the benefits, on how to identify what would be the long-term goal of the project. All right. So take some time between the viewing time now and our time together on Tuesday afternoon in Botswana and see if you can improve your question together. Help improve theirs, help them improve, ask them to improve yours. All right. So last thing to think about. Think about your audience. Who do you want to survey? After you have a really great question, your SMART question, should make it very clear who your audience is. How old are they? What are they doing? What is their occupation? Are they a bus user? Are they a rancher? Whatnot? Are you asking differentially men versus women? Only men? Only women? Everyone? And where are you going to ask them that? Right? These are very good sets of questions because if you can answer these, age, occupation, gender, location, anything else that might be relevant to you, you will be so far ahead when we get further down our workshop series. All right. So jot these things down. Take a moment for you to write down these categories and then see if you can answer who is your audience and what are the characteristics of your audience. So pause the screen. All right. So now let's continue on. So now we've gone through a lot of different iterations, improvements of our question. Now, take that question that you have, and before we get together on Tuesday, after you have improved it, after you have made it smart, after you've identified your audience, after you've identified the barriers and the benefits, after you've identified the long-term goal, upload your question to the prompt on the Facebook group. And that question is, what is the research question that you have created at the end of day 1 of this workshop or this video today? We will post another question that will be, what is your research question that you have created at the end of our interactive session in day 1, which will be this coming Tuesday. Okay. And in order to do that, if you've not done so already, please request to join the WhatsApp group, or the Facebook group, excuse me. See the information in the WhatsApp group that Mr. Kanosiankape put together for us for the instructions on how to request to join that Facebook group. We're already about halfway there by the time of this recording, which was on Saturday. So there should be everybody on the group before Tuesday, ideally. Day 2, this Thursday, and we'll have this video up tomorrow for you to watch. We're going to talk about expanding the question and refining it quite a bit. So we're going to identify variables, we'll identify hypotheses, we're going to talk about social science research tools, and get us to the point where we are ready to really begin the creation of our program, right? So communities matter for conservation. And what you're doing and what we're doing together helps to build the strength and the knowledge of our communities, helps to build the strength and the knowledge of us as conservationists, of whatever ilk, biologists, social sciences, whatnot, economists. And because communities matter for conservation, communities determine the future of conservation. And I think we all probably know this already. By the end of our time together, we will be able to all interact with those communities and learn from them and be able to engage them best in our conservation programs. Thank you for your time. Have a fantastic day.